earlier, I will talk about the design process, more of like what we call the design thoughts behind the project I have done, and we'll mainly focus on two projects, which is the circular economy of architecture, my final thesis work, and another one is the competition work, which is the Tulum Plastic School. So this meta-rig project, I spent about 3 semesters to work on. A standard thesis would take about 2 semesters to do it, because in UTM master program, we will go through 3 different team of project in 3 semesters. Then we will further develop the one that we want the most into the final thesis. So they will add up 2 semester works. But in my case, my design thesis research actually started as a housing design with the social cultural teams. But later then, I further developed into the environmental work base, and lastly carry on to the final thesis. So at first it's appeared, this is based the one that I did, the meta house apartment, when I'm in the social cultural work base. So at first it's appeared just as a typical concept of flexible housing that you can see from other people's project too. But from my stance, I believe it is something that might come in the near future. So I thought maybe I need to understand more about these topics to further understand the reason behind the needs for the flexible housings, and what is the cost or demands of social environment has to do with the buildings. So I started to do a lot of research and studies, and that leads me to this idea of metabolism architecture, which I think very interesting, has a lot of similarities with these flexible housings. So metabolism architecture is actually what we call a movement developed by a group of Japanese architecture during the 60s, 70s. And the idea is about buildings that can mimic the function, like the metamorphosis cycle of living organisms. To simply put, it means they see building as organisms where it can change form and adapt their shapes whenever there are changes or there are demands to self-sustain. So if we look into the practical aspect of this metabolism concept, right, it actually means the building that shouldn't be rigid, but shouldn't be rigid because of the person who uses it are inconsistent. So that's the building. So it would be better if it is a form of combination between series of components to create these buildings. And when there are changes, this module can decide whether they are going to stay or find a more suitable place. So the site itself is more like what we call the docking point or the terminal for the functional space to sit in and form the built environments. So when the demand shifts, they just change the components. And in that way, we could probably fulfill demands without compromising the environments. So one of the most formidable example that we can see is this Nagaki Capsule Tower, designed by one of the founders of this metabolism movement, which is Kishio Kurogawa, during 1972. During that time, it is considered as a very futuristic buildings, because prefabrication during that time is something that can really be seen. And as you can see, the building isn't developed as a whole, but it also actually started from the middle core. And the thing that gives this core meaning is the capsule, the functional space that plug onto the core. So the intention is to give this what we call the free will to the capsule, like an organism to move freely. So when there are changes, this capsule can survive on its own without the needs of these buildings. But then this building doesn't end up well because of the deteriorations that caused by other factors. For example, the suitable programs, misuse of material, and there are disassembled problems because of the design errors, and that leads to too expensive to be maintained because of the the overlapping capsule that block the piping underneath. But then personally, I think this project is still a good example to study because learning architecture is just like a life experience where you get more inputs from failure compared to a success one. So to me, this is sort of like a simulation to see what are the things that could go worse and what are the things that might go wrong, so that we can counter propose for a better one. So from all the inputs and research I come up with, from all the things I've studied, I come up with my own definition of these flexible housings by separating the space between what we call the server modules and the master modules. So each modules will be like an independent volume of space with integrated structures to be plugged into the units to the compound. So when it is necessary for the household to expand or upgrades, new module can be added in or can be extracted when the family is shrinking. And the unit has the capability not only to expand inside the boundary, but also can expand to other units horizontally or vertically, or with these predetermined structural grids. So in the end, each unit would be unique, even from the facade you can see, which is the customization that affects by the type of module they plug into their house. So that could also be one way to express themselves through professional-led designs. So basically, that's about my first project in my social cultural semesters. And every time after I finish a project, I would do a self-reflection to see which part of the design need to be improved. And I personally think that it is a good attempt for me to expose to this flexible architecture, but there are some parts which I think still needs more thinking or improvisations. For example, the modular structures, which I think is overkill because the block itself already have a complete set of beam and column, but just because we want to make the entire house flexible, we create additional room structure with its own ceiling and floor. So it turns out you use more material than usual just to make the house become flexible. So this core and the permanent structures. Another one issue is this core and permanent structures, which they stood up higher mass far more than the flexible housings, which turns out you only save a small amount of voice for the environments and makes the traditional renovation seems more feasible, cheaper, and relevant compared to these flexible housings. So after I carry on this project into my environment work base, which is my third semester, and I continue with this flexible architecture research because I thought maybe I could further explore on this topic, but this time with a different approach, which is from looking from these environmental factors. So toward the end, I can have both inputs from social factors and environment factors to get a better idea on how this flexible housing could really play a role in the futures. So as usual, at first, I don't have any ideas, so I just browse through the internet, journals and articles, until I find a terms. I made this term actually from a talk during the WS, an urban talk, which they mentioned this word, circular economy. And I think that this term is something I have looked into, and that's where I started to look into these ideologies. So circular economy means it's actually a new way to rethink how we can upcycle the packaging of our daily life products so that it can be reusable every time and prevent it from becoming the waste. For example, the bottle that you use to fill the drinks, or even the phone that is considered as a packaging because you don't actually need the material of the phone, but you need it to access the software. So if the phone fails to provide such service or products that we demand, it becomes the waste. And that's the typical cycle of linear economies. Packaging turns into waste even though the material is still intact. So end up we dig more resources and faster than we should. And that leads to the side effects of this resources depletion, especially to those non-renewable material. And not to mention about the amount of carbon emission that has created during this process of material extraction and manufacturing, because those processes require high energy to conduct, which are going to release a huge amount of carbon emission into our environments too. So by looking at the built environment alone, it also contributes to a serious amount due to its large scales. We build, we demolish, and that's the thing we cannot reduce or avoid. And the reason is because of the paradigm shift change in our social environment. So we always seek new things, create new demands. So we keep changing our space, and in this case, the built environment is the packaging and the product is our space. And often we also treat buildings and material as one. So when the building is no longer serve its purpose, the material goes down together with it. But if we look at the ideology that we have learned from this metabolism context, the building is non-existent. It's just a bunch of components come together to form a building. So if we think like that, we will see building differently, which will separate the life cycle of the building and the life cycle of the material. So when the building fails to operate, the material could carry on with their life to other buildings. So in order for us to bring this circular economy into architecture, we must first has a deeper understanding about the relationship between social environments that has anything to do with the buildings. So that's why we further look into building obsolescence. So a lot of people thought that buildings are eternal, so they are built to stay as durable as they could. But end cycle of a building isn't always because of the failure of the structures or deteriorations. Most of the time it's caused by humans, which are nature that keep on changing what we call the changes in social environments. So so if the building could not cope with the changes, it will go obsolete. So these are the major factors that affect the building's value, and sometimes it occurs just like a chain effect. For example, this Nagaki Capsule Tower, like I mentioned earlier, first it was just a physical obsolescence because of the insulation, the asbestos used inside is not suitable. But because of the building typology that doesn't associate this sense of belonging, people started to move out instead of fixing it. And that caused the functional obsolescence. So with all this problem, it leads to the final problem, which is a technical obsolescence, because there's no one there to maintain the building. That's why it turns out as what we call a failure, not really failure, but turns out it doesn't end up well. And that is why these obsolescence factors has a strong association to our human needs of environments. And it's also the fundamental reason that creates demands. So I think it would be interesting to see the comparison between the reason that leads to demand with the obsolescence that caused by demands. So that's why we do a cross-sectional analysis to see what is the trigger point on how impactful it will cause these obsolescences. And from here, we can notice that fashionable obsolescence has a lot of things to do with the needs. And probably that is the idea where people always change their finishes or change their facades. And that could be the reason that leads by this kind of factors. So until this point, we are aware that different people has different desire and almost anything can be the reason for the building to become obsolete. So the building shouldn't be fixed, instead it should be as versatile as it could be. So that's why design for disassemblies is very much being emphasized in the practice of circular economies. You design something just so that in future it can be disassembled without damaging the material, so that it can be reused. So actually this idea of design for disassembly has been done many years ago, back in the day of our ancestors, or even longer. But during that time, they do this design for disassembly isn't because they want to save the environment or what, just simply because of the lack of technology to extract material. And during that time, everything was hand tools, that would be very hard to build a house. So everything was built to be reusable, so that to save their efforts. But because we have technology and machineries nowadays, so we exploit materials. That's why we need to bring back this practice of design for disassemblies as part of the counter solution for the environmental issues. So to start out with this design for disassembly methods, I set out what we call the common compatibilities for all components, so that the reusability of material will be more relevant or effective in the future. And that is why we developed this set of what we call the circular principles. First is to create this compatible grids, so that every component will be compatible to every part of the buildings. For example, a window with a 2x2 window can be combined with other windows to form a 4x4 curtain wall. So a component will have more than one function to increase the transfer demands. And secondly is the hierarchy. This is to determine the scale of manufacturing and number of options, so that component will be categorized from the constant change level from the one that is less likely to modify to the one that is most likely to be modified. For example, like the finishes is the thing that most people are likely to customize. So we have more option, but with a smaller scale that can be changed hand to even by themselves. And for the permanent items such as the column or roof, we try to keep it as standardized as possible with less variation. So this approach could promote an upcycle supply chain that is financially feasible, because it is efficient in mass production and to avoid oversupply with unnecessary variations. Next thing we try to come up with this fundamental set of standardized component. It's just like a Lego bricks, where you have the simple geometry of square or rectangles to start up the form. So this component will be categorized into two types based on the metabolism concepts, which is first is the server module and the other one is master components. Server module is similar like the meta house, but mostly constructed by the master components. So they are like pre-packaged module that only serve as a supporting space for the internals. And all these dimensions are predetermined using the recursion rule I mentioned earlier. So when a new item comes in, they are compatibles. So next thing, also redefine the service system to be located on the outside instead of the inside, so it won't limit the flexibility of changes and expansion, which I will later explain in the designs. And we also create a series of modular jointing system, for example, the wire system or the wall system, so that they can be assembled quickly to make the reusability features friendlier to the users. So when the building has such a wide range of customization, you need to have this centralized control to ensure the appropriateness and safety. And that is why we also integrate some rules with professional-led configuration, for example, the maximum grids that allowed to be expanded, or the type of customization that will be permitted. And the last one is to have this circular management. It's like part of the section in the building that works like a custom checkpoint to supervise the component, to supervise the repair works, and also as a storage for the recycled component that to be exported or to be assembled. So here is an overview of the component detail that I have developed from the circular principle. It is a typical office unit which later forms the entire buildings. So every part of this component is prefabricated and assembled on the site with mechanical joint instead of chemical joint, so that it can be dismantled and relocated easily when demand shift without causing damage to the material, therefore there's no disposal. And every detail of this jointing will have a stipulated installation time and workforce to keep track on the total time taken to construct complete units. And of course, I'm not an expert. During this phase, actually I face some difficulties because I'm not an expert in this field. So I have to find out the contact of the contractors I used to work with and sit down with them to get some input from them. So there are beam connection, there are floor systems, and there are railing system that using the everything will be using the mechanical joints, followed by this planter system, all this system as well. And here is one of the, you can see from detail 7 is a universal snapping joint. Is where I also designed a type of mechanism joint that would be used in most of the components. So the right side is the server modules constructions and a little bit about the connections details. So one challenge we face in this mechanical joint is the closing gap. You need to have the closing gap that's to prevent the water leakings. So during this process, it's quite a challenging process as well. And last one is this sealing system that used to they are using the same finishes modular on the floor, but with wiring attachment that comes in module as well. So in total, it would take about 8 hours to fully complete a unit with just 3 workforce. A unit can complete in just 8 hours. It's considered it's sort of like an advantage because it saves a lot of time, labor, and make reusable features more convenient and efficient. So this is the look of the facade with this fully customizable components. So every unit will be turns out different characters, and that same goes to the layout, which you can come out with all sort of arrangement, whatever you like, as long as it is within the parameters. And since it can be expanded to the next units, so the component is capable to be expanded vertically with a set of staircase module if the upper unit is vacant, or it can go horizontally. But however, each enterprise can only expand up to 2 units on the single level. So the reason being is to avoid the domination of a single level by one particular enterprise. So to maintain the diversity and welfare of each party. So, and a component database will also be developed. This is to record the quantity of component installed on each unit. So this database could also integrate with software for the purpose for modification work. So the user can, somehow modify their modify their offices inside this small software, like when you're putting the seams, where you can test and visualize the layout on the screen before you send the order to the management warehouse. So as for the service systems, riser will rise were channeled directly into the unit from the outmost layer of the building rather than horizontal distribution from the inside. So this is to avoid having any wire or services from the next door crossing through the owner's unit, because that might compromise the flexibilities for future changes. Layout of service systems are also rearranged to have minimal contact as possible to every floor. So instead of having service room in every floor, we bring it down to a centralized floor. So the riser will be designed in a form of module as well that can be assembled during the extraction of structural components in the future. And since the nature of building is designed to change constantly, I also come up with the design of supportive mechanism as part of the building utility to ease the work, and together with these structural jack systems. And this is more like a future narration to demonstrate how this structural component can also be extracted without the need to remove the entire building. So all the structural components will have a predetermined standardized slots that can fit into the jack systems. And when the times come, whether it's for upgrades or maintenance, every part of this structural component will be compatible to the extracting machines to make the disassemble process easier and possible. So to the end of the day, the life cycle of the material will have a more defined purpose that will actually only cross path of the building life cycle, but continue their journey after the building ends. So from this timeline, you can see the material life cycle started at the beginning of the extraction, which is the yellow lines, and the gray line is the building lifespan. So when the gray line ends, the material continues to serve its purpose on the new buildings, which bring it to the stage 5 again. So in that case, from stage 1 and stage 4 can be skipped, which means carbon emission could be reduced too. So the more often a material is used, the more embodied energy it could recover along with the cost of it. So it turns out the material will be more valuable than an actual building because of its reusabilities. And until that point, people will see properties with not only just volume or area, but also preservation of earth resources. That is about my thesis design. Personally, I think it is something more of a futuristic idea. Some part of it can be applied in the current time, where some part is more like a future narration. But then I believe it's doable, just a matter of time. Just a matter of time, because it's just a matter of time. So, but most importantly is the mindset, because it changed how we look at the material and the building, and our way of thinking when designing a building to be more environmental oriented with this circular principle. So that's about it for my design thesis. So coming up next is this smaller scale project that I would like to share with everyone, which is the competition that I've joined, the Tulum Plastic Schools. I know this competition through an Instagram page of an architectural competition company called the Art Stormings. So what they require us to do is to design a community school for these preschool and grade schooler kids on this small piece of land in Tulum, Mexico, which later will be built if we win the projects. And the reason that makes me interested in this project is because of the philosophy behind the school that emphasizes on wellness, environments, and art, which is something that is very much being neglected in the traditional schools. Most of the schools just taught us to memorize things and prioritize grades over everything. However, this guy do it differently. They teach kids about life skills that could bring benefits to their future. They teach them about recycling. They teach them about plantations, all these kind of things, which I'm very agree with. And that is why I signed up for this competition, because I want to be part of it and see how architecture could really play a role in these movements. So it all started with these two friends who bought this piece of land in Tulum 3 years ago. But at first they wanted to build a homestay. So during that period of time where they would go to site often to do their cleaning works. And that is where the kids of our neighbors started to engage them to offer some helps. So that's where they get this community started. At first it was just 2 to 3 kids. But after that, from day to day, they form a bigger communities. It just got bigger until today. They established an organizations. So they use the site a lot to conduct different activities such as workshop, bazaar, teaching and learning session for both kids and adults. So it's just a short period of 2 years, this place has become like what we call a community hub for the neighbors. So at last, these two founders decided to give up on the homestay idea, but to build a community school. And that is why they approached us storming and collaborate with some partners to come up with a proposal. So to me, the things that the challenge about this competition is the location, which is located in Mexico, Tulum, which literally on the other side of Malaysia. So there's a lot of things that we do not know, which, for example, the culture, the social environment, or even the architectural aspects. I spent about 4 weeks in this project, which the first 3 weeks is just purely to understand about the context and the community. So I went on to search from the Google map, to search from the Google Street Views, and even do what we call it, search for the walkthroughs in YouTube, just to stay in front of the screen to see the streets of Tulum for 2 to 3 hours like that. And also I started to look into Ledo's. Ledo is their organization's names. I started to look into their social media to understand about the culture, the communities, and what type of event that they would do. So that from there I can start to have a little glimpse on how the idea might go. So since they become like a community hub for the neighborhoods, every time when there's a festival event, this site will probably crowd with people, but the site itself is far too small to cater the whole neighborhood. So usually they will have roadblocks at one corner of the site so that they could extend the festival onto the streets. So if we were to build a building on top of the site, it wouldn't be a good idea because they need to sacrifice the space to build a block. And that means they have to do more roadblocks to carry out the events. So I thought, why not we bring up the buildings onto the first floor so that the ground floor can remain vacant for the community, so that they can continue this narration of the existing social space. So if you see from the ground floor, all the services will be pushed toward to the corner ends, so that they could offer more foyer space for the public space. And if you notice on the left, it is the existing building, and on the right is the new one that we need to propose some things. And the client actually has a tight budget for this project, so I thought one way we could reduce the cost is to make use of what is already there. So one of my strategies is to tie the new building with the existing one as close as possible so that we can reduce the material and construction costs. So the first thing I do is to create this centralized security point for the existing groups, which is from here. So these are the security group that separates between classroom and the outdoor. So for the new proposed building, the ground floor is basically for the open for the public, but the first floor is meant for the classroom. So it needs to be secure. So I make use of the existing security checkpoint by locating the staircase beside it and extend the grill to the staircase. So at this point, they do not need to have to introduce new security gates, and it is more secure with only just one access point. Then I further look into the existing building to see what is opportunity I can grab from. And I noticed it has a flat roof that could be useful, but I'm not quite sure what is it really on top, whether is it a concrete slab or a corrugated roof. So I started to link to a lot of maps with this satellite views, but all pictures are blurry. Until I find an app on the phone that could, actually look into the 3D street views in an aerial views. Then only then I can get a glance on how the roof gonna look like. And luckily enough, it is a concrete flat roof, meaning I can make use of it. Because my idea is to create more activity space with minimum budget on this small piece of land, so that it can cater all the activities under one place. And these are all the activities that they would do usually on the sites. And sometimes if the site is too small, they would do it in other places. They will rent other places to do it. So my idea is to having all these activities to happen in one place, so to provide as much public activity space as possible to them. And creating space on the rooftop could also somehow elevates the user experience, especially to the kids, to have activities on the rooftops. So with a simple touch-up by connecting a passage from a new building to the existing one, you can have instant access to a huge piece of space without paying a single cent. And that's the kind of solution that would make them happy. So next thing is to define this study experience of the classroom for the children. So if we look into back into our year in kindergartens or primary 1, primary 2, we used to feel the size of the classroom is always that huge and far beyond our reach. But in architecture, we are taught to design based on human ergonomics, the user. So if we think critically, who is the main user for the classroom? So instead of typical room height, we lower down the building so that we can create, we create a pitched roof with one end that is low enough to be reachable by the kids. And that could create opportunity for the kids to learn the life skill and carry on the daily tasks like an adult. So the area with the higher clearance will be area for the mentor or teacher, and the area for the children could also create this kind of sense of responsibility for them to take good care of it. And that's the idea. And this idea also gives another advantage, which is the budget. With the lower building, we use less material, and that's where we can save the cost. So next is the competition team, in which we are required to use plastic in our architectural solution. Because Mexico has a serious issue with overloaded plastic waste. So maybe that's the reason why they want to associate this criteria into the design. But personally, I think architecture won't be a good way to solve the plastic problems. We still can put plastic in our building, but that doesn't make the plastic disappear because it is non-biodegradable. But there is no harm doing it, because find way to make use of plastic is always better than leave it redundant. And you also have one advantage, is that it could save us from using other material, and it's cheaper. So it's more like a plastic solving the architectural problem more than architecture solving the plastic problems. So since we need to associate plastic in our design, I think it would be better to propose a solution that is applicable not only to the school, but also to the community as well. And that's why we come up with the design that can be done hand tool without the need to reprocess, so we can avoid unnecessary carbon emissions. So we come up with a simple idea of planter box with an appropriate treatment and composition, and how every part of plastic bottle can be utilized on the building. And at a certain point, it also can be used as an insulation, but not every part of the solution works out eventually. So yeah, this is the final looks of the building with a stretch of planter box that with a stretch of facade that are full with planter box, and that sort of become like an identity or the spirit to the philosophy of the school. And if you notice, the tree in the middle of the building is also one of the existing components, existing context that they want to maintain, because this tree has been with the community since the first day, and it has a strong association with the place where they used to carry out activities or event around it or underneath of it. So the children are sort of like having this sense of familiarities and attached to it. So in response to that, we create a courtyard to the buildings, so the built environments will grow around it without compromising the trees. And it can be sort of like a gesture for the youngster to know the importance of nature, that we don't simply overrun it. So the construction and materials is quite straightforward. Simple RC beam and post and beam, local bricks and mortar with the timber roof, because I want to keep it simple to avoid discrepancy and obstacles during construction. So the objective is to simplify the details and focusing on bringing out the beauty through bigger pictures, such as the proportions, the building language, essence of greeneries, and the space that evocates sense of community, as well as elevating the user experience. So yeah, this is the final board that I submitted to the competition. And I actually got the second place, which means they were not going to build this proposal. But a few weeks later, the organizer actually contacted me and told me they've decided to build this proposal instead of the first one. And I was curious, because what makes them change their mind? But after that, they did explain to me it's because of the feasibilities, and it is more practical. And of course, it's the people there, which is the founder, is more comfortable with this architectural language, and that is something they need. So lastly, I agreed to collaborate with them to realize this project. So we started to have discussion with the founders to do some modification on the proposals. So this is the final look, where they want a bigger opening for the trees so that it is visible to the outside, and also bigger space for the tree to grow. And eventually they have started the construction about 4 months ago. And this is the latest updates, where they have poured the concrete on the first floor. and you can roughly see the form of the school already. So basically, that's about my presentation for my sharing for tonight. I hope somehow it can give you some inspiration or even give you some insight about the design process. And lastly, good luck for your semester. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, David. That was an amazing presentation. I'm pretty sure it was very insightful for a lot of us here, and I'm pretty sure not a lot of us are aware of David Nee's capabilities. So I'm pretty sure now a lot of people are introduced to how amazing this guy is. But okay, does anyone have any questions? You guys, please, if you guys do have any questions, you guys can put yourselves into the chat box. Please go ahead. But I guess whilst waiting for other people to ask, I actually want to ask David, when it comes down to your design of the meta rig, right? I was so interested in understanding how your principles kind of shape the building in terms of its modularity and then its feasibilities and in terms of all that stuff. But then I was so interested to understand because if I was mistaken, I'm not sure if this is a famous opinion, but based on something I've read, I've noticed when a whole building uses prefabricated materials and then using steel, using these kinds of things, it kind of takes away the humanitarian aspect of the building in terms of its spatial qualities, right? So I was just interested to understand how do you arrange your spaces within the meta rig itself? Is it like, because I noticed you said it was flexible. Does that mean like people can choose wherever they want to place, or have you preordained that or something like that? So I was interested to understand that.
Like I mentioned, it will first start off with this simple grid lines. So this grid will be the one that for them to determine which kind of placement they want. So upon purchase the units, it will be fully vacant. So what they do is just like you went to the IKEA shop, you just put your order, how many wall you want, how many floor you want, and what kind of finishes you want. So you pick all of that through this what we call database softwares. So when order arrive, they will just assemble everything for you according to your needs. So basically, that's the idea about the flexibilities in
Mm-hmm.
this metric.
All right, all right. Okay, so we have some questions here in the chat box. So the first question is from Amalina from Haliman. So she says, "Hi David, a very detailed project and appreciate your very insightful input. I may have missed it during your presentation, but for a project of similar size, how is the comparison in terms of time and cost for projects that utilizes the conventional construction system compared to the modular approach? Probably a rough estimate in figures. Thank you." So she's asking more in terms of, yeah, construction systems and that approach. So please.
Um, well, I need to look through the question again.
Go ahead, go ahead.
Oh, so basically what you're asking is what's the difference between these modular constructions compared to a typical construction, right?
Mm.
So modular constructions are the one that are getting more being practiced nowadays because first it is prefabricated, so that could reduce the what we call the construction error, and everything will be mass production, so that during the construction time it would reduce the time and the cost, and also the labor cost. So everything will be built faster than usual. So that's the way how people wanted to use prefabrication rather than a typical ones. But in circular economy, we give it a little more extent, which these components are reusable because every part of this component are designed in such a way that in the future, this mechanical joint could be disassembled and reused in other place, which it would be contribute a lot from in terms of the cost because reusable means a lot of phases you can skip, like the manufacturing, extraction, everything. So the material will be cheaper.
Okay. Um, let's see. Moving on to the next question. How do you start your design process and how do you develop it? Okay, that's a very that's a very broad question. But yeah, hoping you can answer that one, David. Please go ahead.
How do I start my design process? Uh, um, Sometimes it's just like from the past experience that you have seen. For example, it's not like you straight away have the idea. Of course, it is. For example, when you visit to a place or when you come across the feelings that what this can be this. So you started to question, hey, what is the norm of it and why don't we do something that could replace this? So like during a daily basis, you have this kind of thoughts in your mind. So when it comes to the time it really needs you to apply into the design, you will know what kind of idea that is suitable to be used here. I can give you an example which is a competition that I've joined, the MSSA in MSSA, which is to design a steel dome. So the idea is to challenge the norm where every time when we see the dome, we only can see from afar. By using our eye, we can appreciate it. But there's never a time we think, why can't we actually, how we say, interact with the dome? And that is why our design is to bring down this dome to the human level so that we can climb up to the dome and to engage, even interact with the structures. So that's the kind of thing I think that could create these interesting ideas, which makes you want to really want to have this inspiration to do it. So that's about it.
All right, thank you for answering that one. Then moving on to the next one, Nafisa Izam, inspiring presentation. A quick question: can you share how do you create all of those amazing diagrams, in terms of workflow and software that you use?
I create all those diagrams using Photoshop and SketchUp, sometimes using Revit. And the software that I'm using is also Photoshop. I don't know how to answer this question.
Basically, okay, basically Nafisa he's using SketchUp and Photoshop. Okay. Uh, Basically that's about it. Well, again, in
That's
terms of
more of like a personal taste of how you want to
yeah,
present it.
yeah, I would assume so. Okay, any more questions? Anyone?
I have a question.
All right, go ahead.
All right, so I've seen some of your works even before the presentation, and I would just like to know what sort of inspired you architecturally. I'm feeling a bit of archigram, but I'm not sure if that's the direction or that's the kind of theories that you read when you are doing this project called Matari. I would just like to know. Thank you.
Oh, actually, I got this inspiration during my time in working, where we were required to design houses and all this, complicated details. So I thought, what if one day things could be different? And during that time, that we did a project in I don't know where's the place called, where he redefined a house in just 2 blocks of car park lots. And that's one way to see how architecture could be different in the future. So I started to have this idea of why not in future we have this what we call houses that is sort of able to travel to other places, and the building is just like structures for the car for the building for the houses to dock in. And that is why during my first semester of social and culture, I wanted to further explore on these topics. And that is the time where I also get exposed to this archigram, all this stuff, metabolisms. And of course, those are the inputs I get for me to further develop these projects.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
All right. Do we have any more questions from the floor?
Yeah, actually, I have a question. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for the presentation. Actually, I have a question related to my work because right now I'm doing housing too, but I don't name it housing because there's a stigma about if we do housing, the outcome people have the preconceived idea that the housing project will be very boring and very similar, and then the way that they build is very conventional. So how do you break that stigma? How do you break that preconceived idea of when you say like, okay, my project is actually housing basically, but then how do you break away from that stigma? That's my question.
Um, so what I look into is the current problem we have in the housing, which is become commercialized. So people no longer look the house as it has a good environment, whether is it good for people or not. People look at a house by just looking how many square feet they could, how much does it cost, and does it close to any part of the town that they want to go. So at first I look into these problems where I started to question mass production of this housing. And in Malaysia itself, we have different techniques. So customization of a house would be unavoidable. But we have houses that are built to standardize. That's why when the renovation happens, that causes a lot of this carbon emission and wastage. And that is where I find this linkage of issues with this idea of metabolisms, which later it will be applied into my design ideas. At first, so in general, you just have to identify what is the current issues and how are you going to solve it.
Okay, so building up from that, personally, do you have any hopes about the housing market in Malaysia? I mean, do you have any hopes that from the current issue that you gain, all the research that you gain, do you think there's hope that we will develop housing like in Scandinavia, the way that, like you said in your presentation about community building, all that stuff? Do you think there's still hope for Malaysia in terms of housing in the housing market?
To me, it's possible because in places like Scandinavia, they have uh, what we call they have the the level of development is different, where those country has already excelled or even go into the higher kind of a needs. But in Malaysia, we are still at the phase of developments. So to us, this might be the current stage of our current market, but I believe in the future when we get even higher to the social levels or whatever, we will have demands on that part of things. And maybe until then, Scandinavian country will desire different things, some things even higher. So I think it is a phase that we haven't gone through.
I see. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. I think we'll answer one last question within the chat box, and I guess we'll wrap it out after that. So, David, would you mind looking into the final question of the chat box there by
Yeah.
Muhammad Shazwan Afifuddin? Basically, the question is stating, I really love how you understand the culture and your activities there. But aside from viewing the pictures and videos, which basically the view of travelers or visitors get, how do you truly understand the essence of the site and culture there? Since ODL now, site analysis were just based on the information and the internet.
Is this about the Tulum Plastic School?
Yeah, I assume it's about the Tulum Plastic School, yes. So yeah, can you provide him some tips to understand how to understand better the site?
Google Maps helps a lot actually, because you access Google Maps is just like when you're doing the site inventory. Do you really study those buildings when you're doing site inventory, or sometimes when you miss out some buildings, you just went back to the Google Maps to check? So I think when you have no other option, Google Maps is especially the street view, is the best option you can have. But that's from the the architectural aspect, where you get to know what kind of language that they're using. But from the cultural aspect, the brief actually provides some data, some information about what kind of activities they will do. And like I mentioned just now, because it is a international organization, so they will have a lot of these publications and a lot of publicities. They will post videos, they will post photos everywhere in the internet. So it's kind of easier for me to look for it. So yeah, that's where I get the idea of what kind of culture they would be. Actually, if you search through Tulums, it won't show you the picture of the town. They will show you picture of the island, the picture of beach, which they might create misconception. People thought that, oh, Tulum is about tourism place. So, and that is why you need to further look into it by searching the place itself in the maps, and spend time to look through the walkthrough videos. So yeah.
All right. So I think that will be the final question for tonight. So thank you very much, David, for giving. Wow, someone still wants to join. Thank you. So sorry for the person that just joined. We're just finishing up here. But again, thank you very much, David, for spending your time in providing us this sharing session of your thesis and your latest competition entry. We truly appreciate it. I hope this won't be the last time that you'll be here sharing your works with us. We hope to see you again. But yeah, thank you very much. Of course, other than that, thank you everyone else for joining our session today. We hope to have other talks and sessions upcoming soon. So please be updated by following our Instagram and clicking on the notification bell for updates. So other than that, David, do you have any closing words on your part?
No, nothing much. Just thank you for inviting me over, and thanks everyone for listening. That will be about today's sessions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, David. All right. Thank you everyone for joining. Hope to see you guys again soon. Have a good night.
Nice night. Thank you.
All right. Thank you,
Guys.
David. Thank you, everyone.